Thank you all very much for having me speak today. It's a pleasure. And I've gotten to know a number of you today, and so I'm grateful for that as well. I'm a lifelong resident of Edinburg, although the way the zoning goes, I actually went to Sherryland for my schooling. And since I was in school, I was very interested in the topic of UFOs. Of course, that was really big in the 60s when I was growing up. I used to spend a lot of time in the library reading every book I could get my hands on about UFOs. My mother, my family had a little ranch at that time north of Mission, and she had a very unusual experience involving a UFO in the 1940s that I've spoken about and has been featured in a number of publications. But having her tell that story when I was a young person made me even more interested in the topic. And so over the course of time, I began writing stories myself and books about this unusual phenomenon that persists today. Now, it's very easy to laugh this off and to think and to ridicule it, and a lot of people do. But there's something deeply interesting to people, such that every time I speak, and I do a lot of speaking, public speaking, both in the Valley and elsewhere in the United States, and I've also spoken in Mexico. Every time I speak, there's a line of people that forms to tell me of their own experiences with UFOs, or someone in their family, or some friend of theirs who has had a deeply, I'll say it this way, deeply troubling experience encountering these objects or the occupants of these craft. Two of the most interesting stories I ever had the pleasure to be a participant in have happened here in the Valley. One is the story of a case here north of town at a ranch called San Gonzalez Ranch in 1966. It was brought to my attention by a longtime Edinburg resident, Joe Ponce, who is the son of the late J.J. Milo Ponce, who worked for the Sheriff's Department a long time and later was very involved in local politics. In fact, there's a county park named after Milo Ponce. And his dad was right in the middle of this unusual UFO incident that happened in 1966. I first interviewed Joe Ponce a few years back, and since then the story of what happened in 1966 here north of town has taken off. And I just got back from filming a new TV series that will feature to a nationwide audience for the first time ever the story of the Edinburg UFO incident. And they interviewed me on camera, and I gave them the details of Joe Ponce's story about what happened and so forth. There's another story, very interesting from the Valley, that I'm going to tell you today. And I'm going to have to condense about a 90-minute presentation in about 15 or 20 minutes, and I apologize for that, but we have to stay within our time frame. So if you see me going very quickly past slides, you'll understand what's going on. I'm going to tell you the incredible story of a gentleman named Xavier Gonzalez from McAllen, who had a very unearthly encounter back in the 60s also. In 1967, he was traveling from San Antonio back to McAllen, and when he encountered, he and his brother encountered a UFO and were actually taken aboard. I'm going to tell you this story, which is very little known. Not many people know about it or have heard about it. I'll tell you first a little bit about his background. I had the pleasure for 25 years to be the librarian at McAllen High School. And so when Xavier came forward and told me his story, one of the first things I did was I looked in the old yearbooks, which I had access to as a librarian there, and I found his the story of his years in school. Xavier graduated from McAllen High School in May 1967, and the incident I'm going to talk to you about happened just a few months after that. Xavier and his brother had traveled to San Antonio and were coming back to McAllen, as I mentioned, when this was happened. He's now 76 years old, still lives in McAllen on South 23rd Street. I'm going to show you his residence in a little bit. And there's as you're driving past his house, one of his outbuildings has a picture of an alien drawn on it with the slanted eyes, sort of like this guy. By the way, this is an actual Hollywood design. It was done by a Hollywood special effects artist based on the testimony of over 100 eyewitnesses who have seen these little guys called the Greys. So this is authentic based. He did a compilation of all of their eyewitness testimony of what they saw, what they experienced, and this is pretty close to what the witnesses say they look like. Xavier was driving from San Antonio, July 1968. His brother was in the car with him, and they were about 10 miles south of what is now Loop 410, entering a hilly terrain, and it was close to midnight. When Xavier and his brother suddenly spotted a large metallic craft that, to them, it seemed that it had landed on top of a hill. When I've interviewed Xavier, he doesn't know for sure, because the terrain is hilly there, he doesn't know for sure if it actually had landed or whether it was hovering above that little hill. And he gives us, from my interview with him, he gives some additional details. He says, I was 19, we went to San Antonio with my brother and my girlfriend. However, when they were coming back and had the encounter, it was only him and his brother. My parents didn't want us to drive by ourselves. I'm not sure about the exact date, but he does remember that it was in July of 1968. And he's such a funny guy, down-to-earth guy. You know, he says, I know people are going to say that in the 60s everybody was doing drugs. They're going to ask me what it was I was smoking when I saw this. No, he said, I never did drugs, and that was not an explanation for what happened to me. My brother and I went and had a good time in San Antonio. Then on the way back, we dropped off the girls. We had to stop and get gas right before going back south to 281. We crossed the loops in San Antonio. We crossed the 410. Then about 10 miles further south, I don't know the distance exactly, I saw what looked like a diamond with colored lights. From the angle that he was looking at it, at first it looked like a diamond shape, but as it got closer later on, he saw that it was a disc with multicolored lights all around the perimeter of it. It was up at about it happened at about midnight, he said, maybe closer to 1 a.m. When you're going towards San Antonio, there's a bunch of hills right before you get into San Antonio. As you're coming up on one, you get to see a little bit of San Antonio. When you get to that last one, San Antonio's right there. That is a place where he had his encounter. So as we approached the object, he said, it was hovering on a hill to the west of the highway. We thought it was a water tower that had been decorated for Christmas. You know how sometimes people will decorate water towers with lights. But then the ship started to float down from the top of the hill and stopped right above our car. I guess at that point he understood that this was something very much out of the ordinary. So his brother and himself were looking out the car windows, and they could not believe at what they were looking at. We heard a sound as we came up to the hill. We stopped right on the side of the highway when we saw the UFO, or flying saucer. It was on top of the hill. I've never seen one before. He had never seen one before to that point. We were wondering what it was. It had the shape of a saucer. And I want to play a short clip, and I apologize in advance because the audio is not very good. The microphone that was on this camera did not do a good job of picking it up. But I want you to get a feel for Xavier and what he's like when he speaks about what happened. So here's Xavier himself telling just a few seconds of the experience.
Never seen one before. We were wondering what it was. And then kind of shaking, like a saucer. But I've seen some water towers that are huge that have that kind of shape. It's in our lap of the hill. And then all of a sudden we were looking up, and then the thing just came down the hill. And then came apart right behind us.
So what Xavier and his brother did after that was they stopped their car and they pulled over to the side of the highway. And the craft came up from the hill, and it started moving toward where they were alongside the highway. They actually, it began to hover a short distance away from their car. And this is what Xavier says. All of a sudden we were looking up, and the thing just came down the hill and came right in front of us. He remembers that the ship seemed to move several times from hovering near their car to going back to its landing spot on a nearby hill. Eventually, the ship came back down to hover within 30 feet of their car, and Xavier got out of his car and walked until he stood directly underneath the craft, looking at it. And he remembers looking at the underside of the ship, and he says he described it as it looked like shiny mercury, like it was made of shiny mercury. The lights at the edge kept going around. I don't know if you've seen close encounters where the ships had lights that turned different colors. I was trying to figure out if the lights were going around or if the thing was spinning. I couldn't tell. I'm going to show you another short clip of him describing the object that he was looking at.
Anyway, I was under the ship, looking at it, and the lights at the edge kept going around. I don't know if you've seen close encounters. The ship had the lights turned different colors. The scene light. So I was trying to figure out if the lights were going around or if the thing was spinning. I couldn't tell. It was like 1 o'clock at night. It was perfectly dark.
So Xavier goes on to say that I walked onto the grassy area away from Highway 281 and went under the ship to examine what it could be. Suddenly I sensed there were 2 dark figures in front of me. And I kept asking what they wanted or who they were, but the beings did not respond to him in any way. So the encounter went on. The moon had come out and was a very bright moon. The craft kept moving kind of, when they would approach it, they would got out of their car and they would approach it and it would move away. And then it would, when they got back closer to their car, the ship would come back toward them. He said it was perfectly dark. The full moon was coming out, a big orange moon. I started looking at the moon to see. I wanted to go back and try to put it up against the moon so I could see it against the moon's shape, but the UFO would not let me. And as I mentioned earlier, he had repressed memories about what happened. there was missing time that he could not account for. They arrived back in McAllen much later than they would have otherwise arrived if they had driven straight through. There was some time missing, maybe a couple of hours, maybe more. And it wasn't until many years later that he and his brother realized that their trip back to McAllen had been interrupted. And then the repressed memories eventually came back to him after he had another strange experience, that he and his brother were actually both taken aboard that craft. So the next thing they knew after this encounter, this strange encounter alongside 281, just south of San Antonio, the next thing they knew, they were back in McAllen. They had almost no memory of the drive back. They were suddenly found themselves, kind of in a state of, I guess you could call it shock. And then suddenly they were home. As far as I remember, that was all that I remembered, he says. Let me go to the next slide. As far as I remember, that was all that I remembered. It was like a video that stayed in my mind, so I didn't forget it. You can't forget it. I'm going to have to abbreviate some of this last part, but it's very important. When they arrived back in McAllen, there were little hints that something had happened to them after they saw the UFO. They were both, their clothing and their bodies were, and their hair and everything was disheveled, unkempt. There was dirt on their clothes and their bodies. And as I mentioned, they got home quite a bit later than they should have if they had driven straight through. So then what was it that happened 24 years later that made him realize what really happened that night? So it was turn the page to 1992, 24 years later. He and his wife were living at 2nd Street near Pecan at the Tamarack Apartments. 1992. He was in bed with his wife when he suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and discovered he was no longer in bed. He was hovering face down several feet from the floor of his bedroom, being carried by 4 of these little guys right here. They carried Xavier by some type of levitation without actually touching him. 2 of them were in front, 2 were in back, and they were floating him along in his bedroom, away from his bed and away from his wife. He says they called them grays. They almost look whitish, but I guess you can call them grays. He believes that they were actually floating him back to his bed after they had taken him and done whatever to him, and that they were completely taken by surprise when he awoke from the trance, whatever trance they had put him in. And even though his wife was a short distance away, she was still asleep. He tried calling out to her, but found that he could not make his mouth work. His jaw muscles, everything was clenched. Which, by the way, I talked about my mother having had an experience here in the 1940s where she had a UFO encounter. That was her experience. Was that the UFO was right above her, but she could not move her neck muscles to look up at what was above her. So she had a similar contraction of the muscles or paralysis of the muscles. Okay, so just wrapping up this incredible, just a brief summary of this story. The creatures, he woke up and the aliens immediately dropped him. He fell on the floor hard, he injured himself slightly, and his wife finally did wake up. The four creatures were gone by the time the wife woke up. He got up painfully up off the floor, and it was at that time that he finally realized what had happened way back in 1966. I'm going to show a short clip.
I woke up. It was almost 6 o'clock. It was almost 1 minute. But I was looking at the floor. I woke up. I don't know what's going on. I was like about 3 feet from the floor, but I was looking down. I couldn't stop. I took over my head. And then I saw 2 little creatures there. They were in front of me, looking forward. They didn't realize I was awake yet. Until I turned around, and we were coming out the wall, and these 2 other ones came up. And they saw me, that I was awake. And when I saw him look at the ones in front, and the first they looked at me, and then the other came back and turned around and saw the ones in front. They were already turned around again. And I took it down and I thought, this guy nobody still woke up.
I'm going to have to skip a lot of this, but I want to get to a couple of parts at the end here. There's a lot more to this story, and if I had more time, you would, I'm sure, find it extremely interesting, but we're short on time, so I'm going to get to a couple of points. To this day, Xavier wants to know what happened to him. It still bothers him, everything that happened. It still has affected his life tremendously to this very day, and he still would like for people who have had similar experiences to reach out to him. He's reported this to the Mutual UFO Network, and I promised to show you a picture of where he lives. You see the little alien face, the alien head that he has drawn on his storage building there. And then here's a picture of me and him speaking recently in 2019 at the Edinburg UFO Conference. And finally, speaking of the Edinburg UFO Conference, please make sure to join us for the upcoming conference. November 21st is a Friday, and November 22nd is a Saturday. We're going to have some incredibly good speakers. We're going to have the entire crew of the Ancient Aliens television series. We're going to have local people who have had experiences like Xavier speaking. And it's the Saturday program is the festival, which is free and open to the public, no admission. The Friday does have an admission fee, and you can find out more by going to edinburghufo.com. I would show you the promo video for it, but I don't have time. The last thing is keep an eye out for UFOs of Lost Evidence Season 3, which I just finished filming with the production crew in Austin, and they're going to feature a segment on the Edinburg UFO case of 1966. Thank you all very much for having me.